Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever in the world you are. President Emmerson Mnangagwa was at the UN General Assembly, this annual jamboree where leaders get together and get on the stage and strut their stuff. In Shona, I've got a saying that shiri ina maririro ayo. That means each bird has got its own song. And it therefore comes no surprise at all that when he took the stage, Emmerson Mnangagwa reiterated the same lie that the 2023 elections were free, fair, and credible. Let's just listen to him. I've started the speech in the middle.
Zimbabwe continues to entrench democracy, constitutionalism, good governance, and the rule of law following the recently held 2023 harmonized general elections. I am pleased to highlight that our country enjoyed peace before, during, and after our free, fair, transparent, and credible elections. Zimbabwe has been under the illegal unilateral economic sanctions for 23 years.
Well, we don't have to listen to the rest of it, but there it is. Free, fair, and credible elections. Even our own regional body, SADC, and the AU, the continental body, election observers, said the elections were flawed and illegitimate. And these are not just flaws, the ordinary flaws. These are institutionalized flaws. ZEC, for instance, failed to produce a verified voters roll, not just in one ward or a few wards, or one constituency or a few constituencies. This was the whole country. Zimbabwe failed to produce a verified voters roll. And you go to an election without a verified voters roll. It's ridiculous. Of course it is ridiculous. How can you have free, fair, and credible elections without a verified voters roll? What would be those election observers be verifying your process against? This is at a fundamental level. And yet here he is, still maintaining his positions. Those elections were free, fair, and credible. Zimbabwe is getting nowhere, absolutely nowhere. We're not making any progress at all. And as long as we have got leaders like Emmerson Mnangagwa, the country is not getting out of this mess. This is why it is absolutely important that Zimbabwe is given a chance to implement the democratic reforms so that we can get out of this hellhole that we have found ourselves in. The only way out, peaceful way out of this, is to implement the democratic reforms. And the SADC and the AU election observers gave Zimbabwe that lifeline. By condemning the elections, Zimbabwe then has got to look back and saying, okay, we have got to get out of this. We do not have a legitimate government. To move from where we are now to a time when we'll have another legitimate government, we have to have an interim government. And the primary purpose of that interim government should be implement the democratic reforms so that we end this case of repeated rigged elections. This was the primary purpose of the last GNU, the 2008 to 2013. That was the primary purpose. Implement the democratic reforms to stop Zimbabwe having, in that year, 2008, the elections were blatantly cheated, Zanu PF blatantly cheated, and then for the runoff, used random violence, so that we don't have a repeat of that. The selection of the people who were to be appointed in that GNU, because remember, if the election process itself has failed to produce a legitimate result, you cannot say the people who are going to be in the GNU are elected. They were elected by who? They were not elected. They were just appointed. In 2008, the decision was made by whoever to allow those who had been declared the winners of that 2008 to be some of the people appointed in the GNU. A lot of other people who were not elected or who had lost in that election were also appointed into the GNU. Tsvangirai himself had clearly lost by that definition, but he was brought back into the GNU as prime minister. Atham Tabara, the same thing, and many others. They were not, no one there could say I was elected. There was no anybody who was elected because the process itself had been so flawed that SADC itself has said, no, we can't recognize the result. So the appointment, whoever was doing the appointment was appointed these people into the GNU on the basis of those who had been participating in the last election. But when you look at the result, that at the end of the 5 years, not even one token democratic reform had been implemented. One is going to say, well, let's look back at how the appointment was done. It definitely was flawed. Whoever was doing the appointment did not seriously look into what is it we want to achieve. And if they looked into that and agreed that the most important task to be done was to implement the democratic reforms, then the people they appointed were willfully incompetent. So when we go back, we move on now. We are now in the process where, with a bit of luck, we know, as I discussed the other day, that leaders like President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa are now trying to water down the SADC report so that it could be interpreted as there were flaws, there were problems in the election process, but those are challenges, to use President Ramaphosa's words, that can be corrected. Watering it down so that Zanu PF could still be appointed as legitimate winner of the 2023 elections. That must be resisted. Let's hope that we will succeed in stopping President Ramaphosa tampering with this report and snatching the opportunity for a new GNU. So the new GNU, if we were to achieve it, it must have its primary task. And that primary task has got to be, we want democratic reforms to be implemented so that we've got free, fair, and credible elections in future, and never have to go back into this messy business of elections are held, but the process is so flawed that no legitimate government comes out. And then we've got to have another interim administration. This time we must sort it out. And so the priority must be set that government of national unity must implement the democratic reforms so that we have got, finally, competent men and women who will implement the democratic reforms and get Zimbabwe back on a democratic footing. In considering that, I think the first disqualification will be all those who were in the last GNU cannot be in this new one too. They were there for 5 years. They failed to implement even one token democratic reform. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous that the same people should be brought back again. For what purpose? I know that, of course, Zanu PF leaders and CCC leaders are desperate to be in that GNU. Indeed, I think it's no exaggeration that some of them would make the GNU government, Zimbabwe, ungovernable if they're not in the new GNU. I think that reality we must face, and we must confront it, and we must deal with it openly, boldly, and decisively. MDC, now CCC, and Zanu PF were in the first GNU that failed to implement even one token reform. To argue that they must be in the next one, I think is totally unacceptable. Totally unacceptable. We can't afford to have this new GNU fail to deliver on those fundamental issues, implement all the democratic reforms to ensure that Zimbabwe ends this dysfunctional autocratic political system and move the country to a healthy and functioning democratic system of government. Those who fail to implement the same reforms in 2008 to 2013 cannot be, must not be in the new GNU. What would they be doing, for Christ's sake? If they knew how to implement the reforms, why didn't they implement the reforms then? And for them to hold the nation to ransom is totally unacceptable. And I think this is where we owe the country a big favor. Those who are going to be involved in this decision process. And I think every citizen should be concerned about it and voice their views on that issue and underline the importance of making sure that the next GNU delivers on the reforms. Zimbabwe cannot afford another failure on implementation of the reforms. And Zimbabwe cannot afford to be held to ransom by a few individuals. This has got to stop. The next GNU, the people to be appointed in that GNU we must have confidence, 100% confidence in them that they will deliver all, not some, all democratic reforms and move the country out of this mess. That is not negotiable. And for somebody who goes all the way to New York, to the UN General Assembly, to reaffirm that the elections were free, fair, and credible, surely that individual is not fit to play any part at all in the GNU, nor would many of his colleagues. We must stop this hangover of thinking that Zanu PF have the divine right to rule the country. Zanu PF and their colleagues in Triple C were in the last government, which failed to ensure that the elections were free, fair, and credible. To appoint them in the new GNU will only be to reward them for their failure and to guarantee, which is worse, to guarantee that the new GNU will fail to deliver all the democratic reforms, because they will not be in the GNU to implement reforms. If they were, why didn't they do that last time? I ask again. We are where we are. And I think we should be very clear where we want to go from here. We have been stuck with a regime, a political system that is autocratic, stifled all debate and all meaningful democratic discourse. The system has generated its own key players, those who are in power today. They have an invested interest in keeping the present status quo. They are not interested in transforming Zimbabwe to turn it into a functioning, healthy and functioning democratic system of government. They know, most of them, that if that was to happen, the next election, they will stand no chance of winning. I think we owe it to the millions of ordinary Zimbabweans who have paid dearly over the last 43 years as the nation was stuck with this corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical Zanu PF regime, complete with this entourage of equally corrupt, incompetent, and utterly useless opposition parties. We need to bite the bullet and say enough is enough and demand a new GNU and demand that people appointed in that GNU must deliver on the reforms. That is not negotiable. That is a demand that must be fulfilled. And we must make it abundantly clear that those who failed the nation yesterday are part of the problem, and they cannot be part of the solution too. I think the need for a decisive action is now. If we compromise and let these individuals muscle in on the new GNU, I think the result, I can tell you now, would be, if we are lucky, some of the reforms will be implemented, but the rest will not. And so the country will be forced to go back to elections which can only produce a mediocre government, one mediocre government after another. If we implemented all the democratic reforms, we will give ourselves a fighting chance of having truly competent leaders in power. No one has a divine right to rule Zimbabwe. The primary purpose of the GNU should be to deliver and guarantee the right of every Zimbabwean citizen to have a meaningful say in the governance of Zimbabwe. That should be their primary purpose. It should not be to appease those who think they have the right to rule the country. No one has the right to deny other people their fundamental, basic right to a meaningful say in the governance of the country. Free, fair, and credible elections is not just their right, it is the very basis for good governance. I think it's a noble objective to pursue, and to pursue vigorously and without compromising. Thank you very much, and good night.